right, Dave Hyink, master biometrician. I have to tell you, I'm so happy to have you today on the podcast. You and I got to meet the other day and to talk a little bit in Auburn, one of your homes. And so I have to say, I'm really excited for our conversation today and to get to learn more about you. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm looking forward to this as well.
Well, again, already had to satisfy my curiosity and ask you some of these questions, so there'll be repeats, but can you just please tell me and everybody listening how you got started in forestry?
Well, it's not unlike several of your other interviewees. I grew up in a small farming town in eastern South Dakota. The only forest that was near us was CCC planting from the 30s and about 10 acres, but the rest of it was farmland. And like Strube and like Tom Lynch, I was active, very active in Boy Scouts. I actually was also active in 4-H. We had a 4-H club for town kids that was run by the county agent's wife. So in addition to the kinds of things we did at school and church, that, in a small town, that pretty well captured it all. Yeah. And so I was an outdoor type. I hunted and fished. I ran a trap line my senior year in high school, trapped muskrats. I did just about anything you could do outside. And that kind of set me up, I think. After I got out of high school, I worked for the Boy Scouts up in northern Minnesota, guiding canoe trips into the Boundary Waters and the Quetico Provincial Park. And it was there that I met the connect point that got me to Stephen F. Austin. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I went to my hometown was DeSmet, South Dakota. The famous residents for DeSmet were the people with the last name of Ingalls, Charles and Carolyn Ingalls, Laura Ingalls, Mary Ingalls, Carrie Ingalls, Little House on the Prairie.
Yeah.
Almanzo Wilder lived north of town, and eventually he and Laura met up and got married, and the rest is history. And so my high school was about 200 people, 212 exactly. My graduating class was 44. And the advantage in the rear view mirror, you don't always see this directly, but the real advantage in a little school like that, we had really good teachers, very dedicated teachers, but all of us had an opportunity to participate in just about anything we wanted to be a part of. So I played on the football team, and I was in the band, 3 different bands. I had a singing part in the production of Oklahoma, which it took the whole high school to produce.
Yeah.
So you sort of, that part of your life, you get to try a lot of stuff. Now, you're not good at any of it, but you've done it, and that served me very, very well. I joked a little bit with my friends. We had 200 sets of parents. If we screwed up in school at 11 o'clock in the morning, it got home before we did.
Yeah,
and that had a way of kind of keeping you honest or exposed, one of the two. So anyway, but it was a very, very good place to grow up. I left there with a good sense of myself, a good work ethic. I didn't always apply it, but it was, underground somewhere there, and it served me very, very, very well for the rest of my life. So.
Yeah, I'm from Sherino, if you remember.
I do.
South Nacogdoches. So my high school was approximately 100 people, and my class made up 32 of those.
Wow.
So yeah, we had one of the largest classes that they had. I remember in elementary school that they actually were worried about the teacher to student ratio. So they actually split our class up into two groups. And that was the first time that had happened at that school. And I think it's probably happened since, but I understand where you're coming from a small town. And as you said, the sheriff was and still is next door neighbor to my parents. So it was funny because when we got in trouble, he just took us home. And it's not like we were doing anything bad or anything, but I know what you're talking about, living in a small town. And But being in that small town, you learn at least in my experience, you learn a little bit different work ethic there. You start out life a little bit different than growing up in a big city. Yeah.
And it reminds me, we even had a 10 o'clock p.m. curfew.
Yeah.
If you were under 16, and that, there was a bell that rang at 10 o'clock down by the fire hall, and you could hear it all over town.
Yeah.
And so in theory, we had a curfew. I don't know if they ever enforced it.
Yeah.
But we had one.
Yeah. Tell me about the connection to SFA and how you made it down south.
Well, it turns out that I went up. You have to be 18 to work at the canoe base, and I had already turned 18, so I went up there for training, and I didn't realize that at the time, but they already had me redlined as a hire after I had finished training because they needed a few more staff members. And so I've completed my training, and I was set to go home, and the base director basically pulled me aside and said, "We need you to stay the rest of the summer." And I'm thinking, "Oh boy, pinch me. I'm going to wake up here." And it turns out then that the very first crew that I drew was from Nacogdoches, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And the advisor on the crew was a wildlife scientist, a guy named Dr. John Stransky, and he was a wildlife scientist with the Forest Service. And as you'll recall, the Forest Service had a research lab co-located on the SFA campus with the forestry school.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were sitting around the campfire one night, and he we had a discussion, and he said, with your love of the outdoors and your outdoor skills, you really ought to be thinking about a career in natural resources. He didn't say wildlife. He didn't say forestry. He just said a career in the natural resource field. Mm-hmm. And I kind of ruminated on that. And it took me a couple of years, actually, because that first year I hadn't been to college yet. So, but it was in my junior year. I was in the School of Business at the University of South Dakota. It was competitive entry to get in at the junior level. I don't know how I made it, but somebody must have liked me because I'm not sure I had the grades to get in at that. But anyway, I called. Well, then the next summer, actually, the summer after my freshman year, I was working up there again. I worked up there 5 summers, actually. And the dean of the forestry school, Larry Walker, brought a group up. Now, I just happened to be in the canoe base when he was there with his group. Normally, you're out in the woods for 10 days and you're back for 1 or 2, and you spend most of your time the whole summer out in the woods. But he looked me up and gave me his card and said, if you ever get interested in forestry or wildlife, give me a call. So I pulled out his card and I called him, and I said, I want to come to forestry school. And he says, be here on January 14th or whatever day it was. And I didn't apply to anything. I literally showed up and they took me through the registration process. Harry Wyant was my advisor.
Wow.
And anyway, we were off to the races. And so I spent 2.5 years there finishing my undergraduate. I brought in a nearly completed degree in economics from the University of South Dakota. So I finished that as well. So when I graduated, I had two degrees, basically, or 2 majors, business economics and forest management. And then I met my wife and we got married, and she had a year left. So I had, of course, made a promise to her parents that she would graduate. And so I stayed on like you did.
Yeah.
This time with David Lenhart as my major professor. And in 3 semesters, then I earned my master's in forest management, biometrics, as it were, and then off to Auburn for my first job.
Yeah. Well, I know very well about sticking around because of a lady. Met my wife at Virginia Tech, and she started a few years after me, so I kind of hung around a bit, so I know what that's about. But I'm curious, from your time at SFA, what was it like, meeting and working with Dr. Walker, who I never met, right? So I came to SFA in 2003. And so by then, the people that you have mentioned were already gone. Larry Walker, Harry Wyant Jr., Dave Lenhart, they were all gone by the time I got.
Yeah, well, that just shows you how old I am. Well, it's interesting because Walker was a very, very active scouter.
Mhm.
And we actually had an explorer post, a forestry explorer post within the school.
Mhm.
And but Walker was a highly decorated, adult volunteer, distinguished Eagle Scout, silver buffalo, or not silver buffalo, silver beaver, silver antelope. I mean,
Mhm.
those are the highest awards at local and regional levels you can receive in scouting, and he was there. I mean,
Yeah.
he was, and so we had a really good relationship. And one of the things that that happened with me is, of course, I grew up in eastern South Dakota, about as Norwegian as you can be. My surname is Dutch, but
Mhm.
my father was Dutch. My mother was Norwegian, so we grew up on meat and potatoes and pretty simple stuff. Well, I
Mhm.
got to the East College cafeteria, and I'm telling you what, it was like a smorgasbord of food I'd never seen before.
Yeah.
All the Mexican food and the Southern food, chicken fried steaks and butter beans and tamales and
Yeah.
so I kind of made a little fun out of it. Sometimes I would be going through the cafeteria line, and there was people that served it to you. You just pointed to what you wanted and say, "I think I'd like to try those tamales," and they'd just crack up on the line. Now, what is this Japalino cornbread we got here? They didn't know how to, to take me seriously or not, but
Yeah.
it was quite an experience. I mean, I had not lived in the deep South, and I was forever stepping in it,
Mm.
But you get a pass for a while,
Right.
and so, but it was a great experience, and I enjoyed it very much, very much.
Yeah. I mean, of course, I'm biased because I'm born and raised in Nacogdoches County, but there's something about the piney woods of East Texas that is just special.
Well, there is. I agree.
Yeah. So you had the like economics business degree, you had the forest management degree. Why did you decide to do the biometrics with Dr. Linhart?
Well, it's interesting because when I got there, in my first semester, we took a course, Forestry 317, and it
Mhm.
was called Modern Mensuration.
Yeah.
And what it was a Fortran course, you know, and you learn to program in Fortran, and the examples that Dave Lenhart made up, as for us to work on, were tend to be forestry related. What's the average diameter of this tally sheet? So you'd have to input the data, and you got into a do loop, and you were adding up and dividing by n and that kind of thing. But
Mhm.
he saw very early, I don't know how he picked it up, but he said, he could sense that I really had an interest in computing. And, he's a very subtle, laid back kind of guy. But he
Mhm.
said, there's something you ought to be thinking about here, is that computers are coming on the scene. And he said big companies are buying into mainframe computing, and the forest industry is a few years behind in that respect. But you're going to be right on the threshold of big computing in the forest industry, and it's something for you to think about.
Yeah.
And so I thought about it, and took all the quantitative courses I could, which weren't that many at Stephen F. Austin. I mean, they had one guy in math that taught statistics,
Mhm.
but there really wasn't a lot of. You, you kind of made do with what you could come up with, and
Yeah.
so your committee helped you. Ellis Hunt was a mensurationist; he was on my committee. Cy Somberg, an economist, and between the professors in the forestry school, I I guess I got a minimal amount or a maximum, depending on how you looked at. I got all I could get at Stephen F. Austin,
Yeah.
and knowing full well when I graduated, if I was really going to go where I wanted to go, I was going to have some more education.
Yeah.
But I started out at Auburn and in a research associate's position, and that was a great experience as well. But while I was there, um, I took my engineering math series because I knew I was going somewhere. I just didn't know where. And so I took they were on the quarter system at the time. So I took the two first quarters, quarter one and quarter two of engineering math, or engineering calculus. uh, pass, not pass, or audit, and I
Mhm.
didn't have to pay for it. And so then I took the third quarter and I paid tuition, made an A in the course. And my rationale was I couldn't make an A in the third quarter of engineering calculus if I didn't know the first two quarters.
Yeah.
Well, I got to Purdue, and the admissions officer that I was talking with there said, "Well, you're going to have to take engineering math." And I said, "No, no, no. Look at this at this transcript here. I took the first two quarters, pass, fail, or auditing, and made an A in the third quarter." She looked at me and she says, "This is your life. If you want to screw it up, it's up to you." And, and beyond that, then Brad Smith and Brad had a distinguished career with the Forest Service in FIA, but the two of us actually went to a lab. We taught ourselves linear algebra, differential equations, and multivariate calculus.
Yeah.
And we had a syllabus and a book, and we'd go to this lab and take tests. And so until I got to Math 510 in the graduate school with Green's theorem and all that kind of stuff, I never had a teacher in front of me in math. And so I always claimed I had the worst teacher available.
That's funny.
Yeah. But, that's just how those things work out. And I think we talked the other day, too, about when I got to Purdue, there was a foreign language requirement. And so I made the argument to my committee, which was a very distinguished committee. I'll go into that in a minute. But I claimed that 95 or more percent of all the work in forest biometrics had been done in North America, and it was all published in English.
Mhm.
And what I really needed for a foreign language was a computer language, and I suggested that it was Fortran.
Yeah.
And they bought that.
That's awesome.
They bought that. But just to stick it to me, they made me take COBOL, which was about the biggest waste of time I've
Yeah.
ever done in any computing or anything else.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I was never on a conventional pathway. It didn't feel like so.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I got tricked a bit because after my freshman year, Dean Coble announced, he was hiring students to collect data on the field plots for the East Texas Pine Plantation Research Project, the ETPPRP.
Leonard had the longest and
Yeah.
toughest acronyms I've ever seen.
In my master's defense, I called my method the ETPPRP method, and I should not have called it that.
Good heavens.
I will forever use the Mickey method from here on out. I got so tongue-tied trying to say that over and over. It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
But so Dean hired me to come, help him collect data on those research plots started by Linhart. And so I thought, man, this is really cool. This is what I would like to do. I can, teach and, in the summers go collect data with students. That's awesome. He didn't tell me I'm going to spend most of my time sitting behind a computer, fitting models and, running down bad data and all of that stuff. So he tricked me. And then I, of course, did have access to all the math classes by the time I got there. And so then I'm filling up all of my electives with calculus and differential equations and trigonometry and all of that. And while all my other friends are taking, bass fishing or whatever, bowling, or they're like, "What are you doing, man?" I'm like, "But they told me to take this. Like they said I need it for my master's degree." And they're like, "You're going to get a master's?" I was like, "Well, I hope so." So
Well, you mentioned that. It was interesting because I was kind of the statistical help for a wildlife or a fish. Well, he would be in wildlife, but he was a fish guy, and he was a veteran returning, to college, and he was getting a master's degree, but it was on bass.
yeah.
And what's the lake east of Nacogdoches?
Uh,
Help me.
East Toledo Bend.
Toledo Bend, yeah, and Toledo, but he was catching bass with a hook and line.
Yeah.
And I thought, what a great master's degree!
Yeah. Right.
You're out there fishing every day.
Yeah.
And anyway, so I helped him with the computing means and variances and that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
there was some pretty interesting times back then.
Yeah. How was it working with David Linhart? I met David for probably 5 minutes one day. I don't really know him that well, or didn't know him.
Well, it was good. You know, he I guess he treated me, and I assume the other graduate students, as if, you're no longer an undergraduate. This is your work. I'm here to advise you, to answer questions, and but the research plan, the plan of work, the type of everything you're doing is going to be made up by you and approved by me. They didn't. There were other graduate students, both at Stephen F. Austin and at Purdue, whose major professors took a lot bigger role in their projects and in their education. And so, well, for instance, at Purdue, with John Moser, John Moser did not want to see my dissertation until it was done.
Wow. Wow.
I mean, I had all sorts of friends that were turning the chapter one into their major professor and having it edited and reviewed.
Yeah.
And boy, I'll tell you what, when your professor doesn't want to see the first draft until the first draft is complete from front to back, that puts a little tightening in the old sphincter at times.
Yeah, right.
but I'll tell you, it was the right way. It was the right thing to do. I mean, it made me think very carefully about everything I was doing and why I was doing it. And in the end, you look back on that experience and say, well, that was exactly how it should have been. And that's how it was. And David Leonard was pretty much the same way.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. And so my major professor in the PhD, Harold Burkhart, and David Linhart were office mates in grad school. And
they were indeed. And now I do have a side story on that.
Okay. I was going to say though before, like, I think they had a very similar philosophy with grad students. At least it sounds similar. The Harold Burkhart.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, right.
Well, so anyway, after Harold hired me at Virginia Tech, after I graduated from Purdue, we were in like Sweden at a wood quality meeting and spent a lot of time together. And he was telling me this. I said, well, that must have been really exciting because, there was a group of guys, Bob Bailey, who actually worked for Weyerhaeuser at one time, professor at Georgia, and worked for Georgia Pacific. But Bob Bailey, Al Sullivan, who ended up at Minnesota, but is retired now, lives in Colorado. Burkhart and Lenhart were kind of the four musketeers under Jerry Clutter, and they were all working at the same time. Well, anyway, Harold told me, he said that he and Dave Lenhart were assigned to go out and put in plots, growth and yield plots, right? Mm-hmm. And so they went up to this one house and they introduced themselves. I'm David Lenhart and Harold Burkhart. And the wife from inside the house said, "Who's there?" And he says, "I don't know. There are two brothers named Hart, Len and Bert." Yeah. So, anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So after you finished your master's degree in forest biometrics, you then went to your first job in Auburn. You touched on that a bit, but what was the process of going from? I mean, so you're from South Dakota, you went to Texas, and then how did you get a position in Auburn?
Well, again, when you graduated, and I graduated in December of 72, and 70 through 72 was really tough times, for jobs in forestry. And what made it tough, and it's probably, I don't have any problem with this, but for instance, the veterans, you took a thing most everybody wanted to work for the Forest Service, and you took the civil service exam, and if you were a veteran, you got like 5 extra points. If you were a wounded veteran, you got another 5 extra points. If you had a Spanish surname, you got another 5 extra points. And if you were a woman, you got 5. There was like 20 points available. I am not complaining about this. I believe the veterans earned everything that they got, and they went to the Forest Service and did magnificent jobs. But Forest Service for a guy like me was just out of the question. It just wasn't going to happen in those days.
Yeah.
And so there was a research job came open in Auburn, and they were ready to hire me without even an interview.
Oh, wow.
And so I said, no, I really want to see what I'm getting into. So I went over at my own expense.
Mhm.
And when I got there, it didn't take me very long to realize this is going to be a good place to be.
Yeah.
Mason Carter was the fellow that hired me. Then he had the temerity to leave about 6 months after I got there and go to be the department head at Purdue.
Oh,
And that may have something to do with how I ended up at Purdue as well, at least
right.
initially. But anyway, and he was working on a number of projects. One of them was forest fertilization, and there was another project with Monsanto where they were testing glyphosate as a aerial site preparation.
Mhm.
So I worked on both of those projects, both in the field and as a data analyst. And then they also had the nursery nursery co-op and the weed control co-op, David South and Glenn Glover, Dean Jerstead. We hired Dean in order to replace Mason.
Mhm.
But I had a very good experience there. I was in the field a lot. I met a lot of people. It solidified my assumption that I needed more education.
Mhm.
The station statistician with the Ag Experiment Station at Auburn in the School of Ag, he was the only statistician on campus in those days. They didn't have a department of statistics, but he was the guy. And for whatever reason, he took a liking to me. I mean, he took me under his wing, and we were a beta test site for SAS, the early versions of SAS. So I got to to learn to use that at Auburn. They had a 371 or 360 75, I think, or whatever it was. Yeah, IBM 360 75, pretty powerful mainframe with
Yeah.
probably 256 or 512K. I mean,
Yeah.
that was much better than the 16K we had at the IBM 1401 back in Nacogdoches. But turns out that his name was Dick Patterson, and he was one of my mentors there. And it turns out, I think he probably herded me toward Purdue, but I didn't know it
Mm.
because his son just retired as the dean of agriculture at Auburn, and he's a Purdue PhD.
Yeah.
So he sent me out ahead to blaze a trail, and then sent his own son after. So
Yeah.
anyway, but when I look back, on those days, and really on my professional career as a whole, where there was a key decision to be made, I was fortunate because there was always a caring adult, that was nearby that didn't tell me what to do, but they certainly used the Socratic method, if you will, and asked me the kinds of questions that I needed to answer in order to make a good decision.
Mhm.
So they didn't say, no, you go to Georgia, or you go to Purdue or Minnesota or whatever. But
Mhm.
but here's the kind of things you need to be thinking about. And they would ask them informative questions. Well,
Mhm.
what kind of a mainframe computer do they have at Purdue? Hell, I don't know. But I
Yeah.
found out, and it turns out it was a CDC, which is another world to live in as well. Because you've got 0 and -0, and they mean two different things.
Okay.
Never had a control data machine? You're lucky, buddy. It's octal machine base 8. So you're running everything in double precision. Oh my God, it was a and then of course Purdue did not have SAS. So I
Yeah.
had to use SPSS. It was a social science package.
Mhm.
And the good news is you could write your own subroutines for it. And so a lot of the optimization stuff was, didn't come out of SAS or even out of BMD. We wrote it ourselves and tacked it on to SPSS. So
Wow.
it was an interesting time. Let's put it that way. So
Yeah. I mean, of course, everyone had SAS by the time I got to grad school. And then by the time, I got to Virginia Tech, everyone had even stopped using SAS. Everyone was using R at that point, probably because, at SFA, all of the students got the SAS license for free. And at Virginia Tech, we had to pay something for it. It wasn't that much. It was like $40 or something for a semester, but still, it was something. So
Wow, yeah.
we used R, which was free, and we didn't have to pay that $40.
Well, $40 could last you for a week or two, with buying beer,
Oh yeah, PBRs were like a 6 pack
PBRs.
for $4.
Well, in this case, Lone Star
Oh yeah,
and
back in
Pearl.
yeah. Whenever it's funny you mentioned Lone Star. Whenever my family drives over to Alabama, they usually bring me a case of Lone Star because while it's not very good beer, I still have some nostalgia for it.
Oh yeah,
I love it.
yeah. Well, one of my fraternity brothers, the social chairman, he was buying Pearl by the keg.
Yeah, that's funny. So, all right, back on track now. You went to Auburn. You were learning a lot there, and then you decided, you said, hey, I want to get more education. I need to add a few more tools to the toolkit. So,
A lot more tools, actually.
lot more tools. So you decided on Purdue. You had the guy that hired you had went there, and was there another connection that got you to Purdue?
Yeah, Mason Carter made sure there was I don't know if they still have it, but this was called the LSU Symposium.
Okay.
And every year at LSU, there was a topic of interest, and foresters, went to this meeting, the LSU Symposium. And Mason said that I needed to. He was already gone, but he said you need to start going to this LSU Symposium because you're going to meet a lot of people there, and it's the papers are good, and so it turned out that John Moser was there, not by accident. And I learned later, and so I met Moser and spent a couple of days, kind of close to him, and I guess the thing that I remembered about him was that he was a guy, and it was clear to me from the beginning. If I went to Purdue, I was going to work with him, not for him. And for me, that made a big difference, because I had access to him anytime I wanted to. That wasn't true with some other programs, which I won't mention. But John was very hands-on. You worked with him. He defined what you needed to be doing and what he needed to be doing, and it just worked out really well. We had a really good relationship, and so when I got to Purdue, then my goal was to. I had a plan of study that didn't look like any plan of study anybody seen, and at the PhD level, maybe it shouldn't. But so I took Tom Beers was on my committee. Moser was my major professor. And then I had three other people, Virgil Anderson from statistics, and then two people out of industrial engineering. Alan Pritzker, who is the father of the GASP SLAM simulation languages, and then an OR guy named Ravi Ravindran. And so I had a really interesting committee, but every one of them were the authors of the textbooks I was studying on. And again, it sounds weird, but it's just something that made sense to me. So I had coursework in statistics, I had coursework in math, I had coursework in industrial engineering, I had coursework in computer science, and I basically put together a plan of study that would allow me to march into a place like Weyerhaeuser or anywhere else and be close to, the development of management systems and growth and yield models and all those things that we hold sacred. But somebody once told me that I made myself scarce relative to demand by the coursework that I took.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. That's true. So if you look at my transcript, you'd say, well, is this guy an industrial engineer? Is he a computer scientist? Is he a statistician? So what the heck is he?
Yeah.
The answer is a little bit of everything.
Right.
So,
when people ask me what is a biometrician, I say, well, it's about 5 or 6 different professions in one. Because It's not, I mean, because if you think about what do biometricians do? Well, we're in charge of inventory, whether it's related to what's on the ground, in the past, in the current, in the future. What's it going to be? What's it going to look like if we do these changes? If we, mix up our silviculture regimes or replant these genetics? So you're talking about needing understanding of physiology and all sorts of things. And then on top of that, computer science, mathematics, like engineering, we do it all. And then, we have our fingers in everything. We have to understand, the accounting side of things, the business side of things. So what is a biometrician? It's a bunch of things.
It's a bunch of things. Well, it's interesting. We were watching a show on TV last night, a rerun. I'm trying to think of the name. Well, Matlock was the name of the name of the show. But one of the guys there, it hinged around a professor who was married by common law to another professor, and they were both biostatisticians.
Yeah.
Right? So my wife turns to me and she says, "Are you a biostatistician?" I said, "Well, I probably am."
Yeah, right.
So anyway, so at Purdue, then I started out on a research assistantship. And then because John Moser at the time was, every ag student at Purdue had to have a course in computer science or in programming to graduate. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was then. And so John taught that course. It was CS 210A. The A was for agriculture. But Mason thought that he was he was overqualified to teach that. He enjoyed teaching it, but he turned it over to me, which I really enjoyed because it like tripled my income.
Yeah.
And so I was an instructor in the computer science department. So I had an office over in the forestry building, and I had one in the computer science building, because that's where all the students would come for help and office hours and that kind of thing. So anyway, one of the things I did was, again, where Dave Lenhart had you computing things about trees or logs or lumber or whatever. I thought, well, if it's 210A, we better have our computing assignments, our assignments about do loops and all of this kind of stuff, and where we have an ag context. So I went over to the library and I started going through the Ag Experiment Station publications, looking for opportunities, for data and for problems that were ag related. And the famous one, which I had an interaction with Purdue Ag here about a month ago when the Auburn played Purdue in basketball. The two ag schools had a joint socials hour before the game. And I met the new dean and I told him, that I taught CS 210A, and told him the story I'm going to tell you. And he said, "So you're that guy."
Yeah.
And so one of the things I did, my more famous thing, was that I found a experiment station publication that had raw data in it, and it was about the fecundity of hogs. Breeding success in hogs.
Yeah.
And so what they found was there was a high correlation between breeding success and the mean rectal temperatures at ovulation.
Okay.
So I had an assignment of computing the mean and the standard deviation of the mean rectal temperature for ovulating hogs.
Yeah.
And of course I told them it was out of Egg Bulletin 21 or whatever it was. And so a lot of them would race to the library and get that bulletin. Well, all of a sudden, some guy in swine production, all of a sudden, the number of his publications that are getting checked out or sent from the library just went up like a shot. But I used that thing every semester till I graduated. So I look for other things, but that was the one that sort of really took hold. The students got a big kick out of that. In fact, I run into former students and they still remember that assignment. So
So hey, everybody listening, publish your data.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I watched Mike Strube's interview with you,
Yeah,
and the statistician he was trying to remember was I.J. Good.
IJ Good. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was notorious. I mean, in the statistics department, but he was very, 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 very good. And
Yeah.
but I'm no pun intended.
Yeah.
That's who I'm pretty sure Mike was trying to remember.
Yeah.
I don't know how I could never forget him, but I
Yeah.
didn't take his courses either. So
Yeah. But that was your next step. So you finished your PhD at Purdue in 1979, and then before you finished, did you already have your position at Virginia Tech, or was it
oh,
after?
I was signed, sealed, and delivered like a year before I graduated.
Oh wow.
Hosner came roaring in there and made a stop in West Lafayette,
Yeah.
and before he left, he had my foot nailed to the floor.
Yeah.
And again, it was don't throw me in that briar patch. I mean, frankly, I was thrilled to go to Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
You're a newly minted PhD, and you start at arguably what's the head of the top of the food chain.
Mhm.
That's not all bad.
Yeah. Not at all.
And so anyway, I was more than happy to do that,
Yeah.
and so I was there only about 16 months though before I Weyerhaeuser. Well, they came calling before that, but
Hmm.
remember what happened was that we were having one of the co-op meeting, the early PMRC, or I don't know, it's the names changed, but it was to be the growth and yield co-op, and there was this buzz between Otis Hall, who was my department head, and Harold and John Hosner, that with these Weyerhaeuser sending two guys from the West Coast, Connor Boyd and Pete Farnham. And Boyd was like the VP of R&D, and Farnham was the section manager or whatever. And and apparently they knew that Weyerhaeuser was after somebody. They just didn't know who.
Yeah.
Well, so Connor Boyd just marches into John Hosner's office and said, we're here to interview or Dave Hyink.
Mhm.
And and it was interesting because John, that was a good news, bad news for Hosner.
Yeah.
And the good news for him is he was always very proud of the fact that people were after his faculty,
Mhm.
and good, bad, or indifferent, he's proud of the fact that he's hiring people that everybody else would hire.
Mhm.
And the downside is that a lot of times people like me, and I wasn't the only one, but just didn't stick around very long.
Yeah.
And I think I don't remember if I mentioned this to you at all, but I remember sitting down with Harold and Otis and Hosner before I left, kind of an exit interview.
Mhm.
And we had what I during this my term, the 2 or 20 discussion. And that was that if you're going to go away to Weyerhaeuser, you can come back here with a lot of knowledge that makes you a better professor, but you can't stay away from Virginia Tech more than 24 months or you'll never get promoted.
Yeah.
Tech was notorious for difficult
Wow.
promotions.
Yeah.
And they said, if you're gone more than 24 months, the other thing you can do is stay away 20 years. And then come back as a adjunct or whatever, and really pontificate on what you know and what you've learned.
Yeah.
And that stuck with me. But I got out, and I was really planning to do the 24-month thing.
Mhm.
But Weyerhaeuser Company had the project slate and the team in place and the R&D organization that, man, there's no way anybody in their right mind would leave on their own.
Right.
At least I didn't think so. The work we had was, in retrospect, I look at it was all demand pull. It wasn't R&D trying to sell somebody that they needed a growth model or they needed a better site index curve or whatever it is we were doing.
Mhm.
That knowledge was resident in the operations, and they were waiting for the letter to come in the mail with it. I mean, it was demand pull all the time, and sometimes we had to kind of drag our feet a little bit because we didn't want to put anything out prematurely.
Mhm.
That being said, there was quite a protocol, if you will, on version control. You didn't want somebody in there saying, "Well, I got a new version of the model. Here it is."
Mm.
We're going to have one model or two models or whatever it is, and they're going to be our standard go-to, and we're not going to change them until we've gone through a process to change them.
Mm.
And I like that kind of discipline.
Yeah. Yeah. Same.
And they knew what they wanted, they knew what they needed, they knew what was realistic to get over a time horizon, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so that made it a lot of fun for
Yeah.
me to work. And again, in 1980, then I showed up in June of 1980 at Warehouse, and that would be 14 years after the advent of what they called high yield forestry. 1966 was the stake driven in the ground by Jim King and George Stabler and the powers that the heavy duty, the heavy lifters of that era. And so of course we were living in a plantation world at that point, and
Mm.
we're still harvesting second growth, but not a lot.
Mm.
We hadn't harvested old growth for a couple of decades. And so, the data we had were, a lot of board back plots, temporary plots, any place you could grab data, anywhere you could find it.
Mm.
And I've said many times, models are really easy to build when you don't have any data. Yeah, the more data you have, the more difficult it becomes. But
Right.
so anyway, we spent a lot of time and effort, analyzing data, looking at our we called, I guess I would call them missing data suppliers, primarily supply missing heights because we didn't take heights
Mm.
on every single tree on every single permanent plot, or even on every temporary plot.
Mm.
And there are good ways and not so good ways to do those data suppliers. But
Right.
that was something we were working on. I spent a lot of time just going through data graphically. Yeah. We had one of our business clients, a guy named Dave Depta. In fact, from previous interviews that you'd done, they talked about the MUDA function.
Yeah. Right. The mother function. Yeah.
And that was a probability mass function based on the gamma distribution, but it was discrete by diameter classes.
Okay.
And it was parameterized with 2 or 3 parameters. I forget how many, maybe 3.
Mm.
And that's how the inventory was stored. I mean, we didn't have, storage capacity to take an inventory and store the trees.
Mm.
Because at that time we had 7 million acres. Now they got 11 or 12.
Wow.
But so anyway, that the inventory carried the data, but it was as a stand table that was characterized by the MUDA function.
Yeah. So what's it was the parameters of the gamma distribution that were stored?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Wow.
then, of course, when I came on board, we were working on whole stand models because that's all the data we had. And
Right.
by the way, it was confounded by the age of planting.
Yeah.
And I'll go into that a little bit later. But anyway, we the other thing, you just didn't have carte blanche.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of did in a way that was under the covers. But basically, we had an inventory system that stored stand tables as parameterized gamma functions.
Mm.
So if we build a growth model that needed to talk to inventory, the growth model had to be able to carry along and forecast those parameters, right? And so that's where things like parameter recovery. Tom Lynch was talking about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was another one of those things. I wish I could claim to be as smart as he made me sound.
Yeah.
But what I was really doing when I recovered the first set of parameters, if you will, I was looking for a technique to get better initial guesses to fit the Weibull.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I said, God, these parameter estimates, they converge almost instantaneously. Well, it was basically a bastardized method of moments is what parameter recovery is. It's nothing beyond that. You've frozen up. No, you were looking at stuff.
I was writing notes as because I've heard some of these stories, but I haven't heard it the way that you're telling it now. So
Well,
I love it.
I don't want any warehouse or lawyers coming after me, but
Yeah.
and they won't. I as I say, I know where the lines are.
Yeah.
but it and then all of a sudden, there we were, and so, but my PhD thesis was in northern hardwoods, and it was a parameter prediction system, which worked okay, but it wasn't very robust. I mean, I guess the other axiom another one of my axioms is, if you go back and reread your PhD dissertation and you don't want to barf, you haven't done good work yet.
Yeah.
You know, wait a minute, what was I thinking about back there? Jeez, what a piece of junk this is.
Oh, mine was in the trash somewhere. I don't even want to look at it again. I was happy that I did publish eventually out of my dissertation.
We did too. We
My
did too.
God, yeah, it was. Yeah, you look back and you're like, what were you thinking?
Well, it was the ancillary stuff. It was the parameter recovery and some other stuff, and thinning algorithms. We're changing one distribution to another, and that's the kind of stuff we published on. John and I did out of my dissertation.
Yeah.
The actual growth model for northern hardwoods, was secondary to all of that kind of stuff. That's just the way it worked out. But
Yeah.
anyway, I had Tom and I were good buddies. Tom was infinitely smarter than I was, and it made for good bedfellows, I guess. He was very patient with me, and we just were good friends till the day. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, let's see. Well, so then, and I'm going back to John. I have a little bit of advantage because I've seen Johnsons, I've seen Mikes, and I've seen Lynches.
Yeah.
So, and one of the things I noticed there is, we moved on. As you move through controlled upgrades, it became clear that in order to really get the level of precision that we needed on decisions, that we had to be able to identify trees, not stand tables. And what made that possible? It wasn't the fact that the model we had didn't work pretty well. It's the fact that they finally made a decision in the inventory to store trees, right? Without the ability to store trees in the inventory, a tree list model is just another model, and it's overkill if all you really understand is the parameters of the meta function. And there was a general evolution, and then Greg came about that time. We bought Willamette, and we got Greg Johnson, and he was very familiar with the organon structure, and we were actually, you go through a process if you're smart, I think, where do I make it or do I buy it? And up to that point, we always made it because there wasn't anything else out there. I mean, we were frankly, we were on the lead wave going through this thing, and we didn't have any literature to go to. We had a growth model architecture as opposed to yield architecture. We had quite a different scenario than the literature at that point. And but when we got to the treeless model, there had been some model. Potato, for instance, was active. Organon was active, and so it would pay us to take a very deep dive into those treeless models or those tree models before we started from scratch and build our own. And so it was very clear after really digging into Organon that Dave Hann had produced pretty much what we needed. There were a couple of things that we needed to tweak, but it was going to serve us well. But I remember we hired Dave with an NDA, and we sat down in Oregon for 3 days. Strube and the people from the South were out, and it was one of the most enlightening 3 days, because we knew Organon, we knew Hann did good work. He knew that we did good work, but he didn't know about any of it. and so we were able to just sort of open the veil, open the curtains on stuff we were working on, and it was really quite a session. And so anyway, when we finished up with the treeless model, the variant of Oregon, if you will. We worked on them both. We worked on the Douglas fir and the Loblaw model simultaneously. We'd never done that before. We either swapped. We were either working on loblolly or we were working on Douglas fir. We worked on western hemlock as well and red alder out in the west. But we'd never sort of bit off the whole enchilada. And that was a real interesting experiment, if you will. But and then what happened was as we got started with that, then 9/11 happened. And of course, air travel, probably, I would say that our air travel going back and forth, we'd usually, up to then, we would, every quarter we would fly into Memphis and we would stay at a hotel in Memphis and we'd work 4 10-hour days and then go home on Friday. And then every night we'd go out and eat Memphis barbecue. It was wonderful. Well, but quarterly we'd have these 3-day, 4-day meetings. And when 9/11 happened, man, that stopped it. And probably 2/3 or 3/4 of our air travel went away, and it never came back because we had developed a whole new work model, at least for us, and it involved a Microsoft product. I don't remember what it was now, but it linked our computers. And then we had headsets, and we were on the company telephone network on a conference call. And we did that every Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock Pacific. And it could be a 5-minute call, or it could be a 5-hour call, or whatever, But the fact is, we were all communicating once a week for a fixed amount of time against an agenda. If nobody had an agenda for the meeting, it lasted about 5 minutes. Because we had a policy too, where we didn't go to very many meetings if it didn't have an agenda.
What was the reason for meeting in Memphis? Is that just like the best place for all the team together?
Yeah, it was the locus of points, if you will. It was a single airline leg for everybody. So there was a direct flight from Seattle, from Portland, from Raleigh, Durham. Anybody that flew, it was a single flight segment. There was no changing planes, anything like that. And of course, for the people in Arkansas, they could just drive. And that way we had cars there, so we never rented any cars. I mean, we didn't think of all this at the outset, but we got really, really efficient at what we were doing because we communicated so much more. And so even a once yearly meeting face to face was, in fact, we didn't always even do that. And so we ended up bringing this project in ahead of schedule and under budget. And we got a President's Award as a team for doing that, for a new work system. And so anyway, part of the President's Award is everybody gets to show up in Federal Way, and up on 5th floor where the heavy breathers live, they put on a dinner. And so it was interesting because there were 10 of us on this team, and 2 of them had never met face to face before.
Wow.
We're going, holy cow, how is this possible? And so it was telework, originally. Now again, it would have been a different story with Zoom, I suppose. But this Microsoft product, it allowed us, for instance, if Mike wanted to do something with, let's say I've got some SAS code and we're trying to code in a particular routine to fit some statistics, I guess. And if Strube saw something that he wanted to try, I could give him control of my computer and he could go and work on my code.
Yeah.
And so that kind of stuff was all new to us. But everybody embraced it, and frankly, I would never go back. We became so much more productive. We saved money, saved time. Just it worked out really well. But I think at least the annual meeting that we would have, there's something to having face-to-face meetings. I don't think you can forever do it just remotely like we're doing this. And so one of the things we determined that one of our favorite places to get ribs was a place called Corky's. In fact, Corky's actually you can get them in Publix now, but their ribs were fabulous, and so when we had our final uh, review of the treeless model right before I retired, a few months, we had Corky's flown in Federal Way, and the cafeteria in the tech center, put on a Southern barbecue for us with Corky's ribs. And it was all the timberland strategic planning people, everybody that was part of our sphere, were all there, and it was really quite an event. But anyway, I was blessed to work with extremely smart people. Uh, I learned as much from them as I learned from anybody else. Uh, and so right now I've just talked about the modeling stuff that we did, the pure biometric stuff, everything from, like I say, from data replacements to site index curves to whatever. But because of where I was located, I had another, I won't call it a career, but another set of experiences beyond that. Uh, in everything from work on the FIA, the fixed plot design, or the map design it's in place right now. I headed a committee that worked with the Forest Service on the design of that. Uh, worked. Had special time where I was kind of the lead industry guy, if you will, on the acid rain controversy back in the 80s. Mike Clutter and I, took that on. I was chairman of the AF&PA, American Forest and Paper Association, had a research subcommittee, and I headed that research subcommittee, and it was made up of volunteers from industry and academia, because we were working on relevant projects. We were working on acid rain. We were working on FIA. And so there was just a number of opportunities, things that I was on both national blue ribbon panels for FIA. And so I spent a fair amount of my time on those particular issues. And so there was just more to my career than just fitting equations, if you will. And then I'm trying to think, there was one other thing I was going to bring up. I lost it.
I wanted to ask you because we kind of went from Virginia Tech directly into Weyerhaeuser.
Yep.
That was great. But so I'm curious though, because you have lived all over the U.S. So you went from South Dakota to Texas, quite a bit different.
Yep.
Auburn, which is different from Texas. I mean, you're getting.
Well, we had George Wallace in those days. That was
Yeah.
different from Texas.
Yeah, get into the Piedmont there, and then you go to Purdue, which is obviously in the north, which you
Corn
have
and soybeans. Yeah.
Virginia Tech, and then boom, all the way across the country to Washington State.
Yep. Got to be flexible. You got to be flexible.
Man, have you seen some different forest systems in
That's true.
Actually, at that point was a really short time span, considering you spent what, 27 years, almost 30 years at Weyerhaeuser.
27 years at Weyerhaeuser. Yeah.
Yeah. So how was it now going to? Were you based in the Seattle office, in the main office?
Yes. When I first joined Weyerhaeuser, forestry research was in Centralia.
Okay.
And we actually, it was at the height of forestry research at Weyerhaeuser. We were in 4 different buildings in Centralia. And again, you go through cyclical budget cuts and these types of things. But we were in the back end, growth and yield. We were had the back half of a carpenter's union hall that was next to the research center. There was another whole group that was in the old hospital. And there was even apartments in the old hospital. So we had employees that were working in the old hospital and living in the same building.
Yeah. Wow.
And then there was a big grocery store that was abandoned on Tower Street. We had a group in there, and then the regular 505 Pearl, the regular research center. So we had people coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
And then about 2.5 years in, they took a sort of a relook at everything. And one of the things that They were going to close Centralia, but Centralia is still open today. So that'll tell you how successful they were. Those people just wouldn't move. But anyway, they moved our group, uh, the growth and yield group, up to Federal Way, so we were closer to our business client because our business client was Timberland Strategic Planning, and uh, and that was a good move for us. At least I thought it was. And but being up at the tech center, just from a career standpoint, I was involved in a lot more stuff than I would have been in Centralia or Hot Springs, or not that there's anything wrong with being in those places, but I just had opportunities that I didn't imagine. And so the other thing I had a chance to do is we had one of our we had a scientific. There was a management ladder and a scientific ladder at Weyerhaeuser, and so people that wanted to go on the M track could get on the management ladder. But if you were a scientist and you wanted to stay on the technical side, it was like Boeing had the same sort of structure. So there was the S ladder, and it started at 4. Don't ask me why I didn't start at 3, 2, or 1, but I think it started at 4, and the top rung was 8. And so you could stay on the scientific ladder. Well, as I moved up on the scientific ladder, I got to a point where I was a member of what they called the Council of Scientific and Engineering Advisors, and it was level 7. It was step 7 across the entire technology organization. So we had pulp, paper, and packaging, wood products. Everybody that was in R&D, if they were, and there weren't a lot of 7s. I mean, I don't know what. I'm trying to think. There were 2 of us from forestry, Roy Stonecipher and myself. But anyway, we would meet monthly, and somebody from one of the groups would make a presentation on what they were doing. And the idea was that you got the leadership, if you will, the upper rungs of the science ladder, familiar with what other people in the building were doing. And I liked that a lot. That was really interesting. So then one of my contemporaries was in pulp, paper, and packaging. They were having a problem. I don't even know what it was in Memphis, or yeah, it was in Memphis, I think. And it was a problem that involved a supplier, DuPont, and it was in a paper mill. I don't claim to know what the problem was, but DuPont came in and held a brainstorming session, a problem solving group. And DuPont had a group called Oz Group, and you can look that up. It's still, you can understand what it is, but it was a volunteer group of people, technical people within DuPont, who would get together and try to solve problems. Well, Pete Lancaster was my contemporary, and he was a part of that as a customer. And he came back and made that presentation to COSIA, and we said, "Man, this sounds really interesting." So we talked to Norm Johnson and said, "Look, here's what we'd like to try this." And he said, "Well, I can make some money available to you and some time and that kind of thing. But it's you 2 guys design it. You run it the way you think it needs to be run." And so we did. So the first thing is we found a problem, and then we just selectively picked some people that we knew to be on the problem solving team. And then DuPont came in and ran the session and trained us on how to do this. The Oz group came in and trained us. And so we ran this thing, I guess, I bet a decade before we burned out on it or retired or whatever. But it was a very interesting, we had over 300 volunteers. All we anybody that wanted to be a part of it, if you were an admin assistant, if you were a janitor, if you were a PhD, the only thing that we didn't allow was direct line managers. In other words, if you had a problem that you wanted to solve, your manager wasn't any part of this. And oh, by the way, if we heard your manager said, "Well, you can't solve this, take it to the committee," which what we recall, we wouldn't take it. I mean, we wanted to be a forum of early opportunity, not a court of last resort. And man, did we have some fun. I mean, just the various problems we were working on. One I think that I particularly remember is there was I don't know, it was years ago, but we lost methyl bromide as a nursery fumigant, and that was a big deal. That was a big deal in forest nurseries, and so we ran a session on alternatives to methyl bromide, and I'm telling you what, it was science fiction all over. And it turned out there was an engineer. In fact, it turns out this guy had more patents than any engineer in the company.
Mhm.
And he came in and he had this design, this machine that you pulled over the nursery bed, and it injected steam into and then covered it with black plastic. I mean, he'd thought it all out, and he knew all the equations for how fast the heat dissipated and what it took to kill, whatever methyl bromide killed.
Yeah.
But I mean, I just sat there with my jaw locked open. And he just held court for like several hours.
Yeah.
And but the way the committee worked was, we would put out a call that we've got this problem, and people would say, I'm available, and we put together this group.
Mhm.
And then we would solve maybe 2 problems in a session, one morning and one in the afternoon. Then we'd have a dinner in the evening, and we'd invite a vice president of the company or somebody, the CEO, to come and talk to us. So it was a social event. It was a problem-solving event. But the protocol was that everything that was like, it was like a self-help group. Anything that was said in there stayed in there.
Yeah.
And the presenters owned all the ideas. Now you could, what we encourage people to put their name and their extension. So if there were questions, but there was no downside whatsoever to a presenter to come in and get help from us.
Wow.
Because no one's going to, no one's going to, rattle their turf or invade what they're doing.
Yeah.
And man, it was exciting. It was really exciting. And this is an opportunity that had I not been in Federal Way, I might have been a volunteer.
Mhm.
Volunteers came from North Carolina, from Centralia, from
Mhm.
Oregon. When we'd have a session, it was just that much fun.
Yeah.
And we had a budget to pay for their time.
Wow.
And so anyway, we probably got way off on the
No.
tangent there, but it was those kind of things. Then I spent a lot of time, working on establishing the stand management co-op. I was on the technical advisory committees for crafts, a number of different co-ops on the West Coast and even the South.
Mhm.
So I just had a lot of input to things and a lot of exposure to things that I didn't sort of plan on when I was, early on, but they just happened, and every one of them just made me better. In fact, I often said, I told my colleagues that I've got the best job in the industry, and nobody ever argued with me, ever. So,
well, yeah, and I, now have quite a few friends working at Weyerhaeuser on the biometrics team, and they're scattered all over the world, much like probably your team was.
They got more biometricians now than we even dreamt possible.
Yeah, there
was another side story I'll tell you really quick. So anyway, there was a time when we expanded in biometricians. We bought Macmillan Blodell in Canada and got Nick Smith, who was an Oregon State graduate. And then we bought Willamette and we got Greg Johnson.
Yeah. And
somebody said, well, who would you have for your replacement? And I said, well, I'd like to have Dave Marshall, but we can't afford to buy the Forest Service. We got Marshall anyway. So
yeah. Well, that's what you were telling me. He just retired similarly as Greg Johnson around the same time, and
yeah,
I don't know Dave that well. Actually, the only interaction I've had with Dave is that I did interview for Weyerhaeuser at one point in time, and we were on a joint phone call, and that was about my experience of Dave. But I know him professionally, and so your replacement just retired. So
it was interesting too, because I think I mentioned to you it was one of the few times that we hired him 6 months before I left. And so we had an overlap of about 6 months. Now I was engaged on things non-biometric in those last 6 months, which I really can't talk about.
Mhm.
But my job was to introduce him, socialize him into the profession. So
Mhm.
man, we went to Nemo, we went to Somens, we were all over the place, you know,
Yeah.
and I think that worked out well for everybody. So
Yeah, for sure. And it's good to see the Warehouser supporting the biometrics team to go to those meetings. Because while you guys don't, I say you guys, you're retired now, but while Warehouser doesn't publish much of the research that they do, while that research stays in house, having very intelligent individuals at the meeting saying, "Hey, you might want to think about this or that." That's really helpful, and it's really influential, I think, in the biometrics world,
sure, sure.
even though you can't directly publish or talk about some of the things that
Yeah,
you've done.
yeah.
Yeah. Uh, and I wanted to, so you did 27 years at Weyerhaeuser, and then you got to a moment where you're like, okay, I'm ready to hang my hat up.
Yeah.
And then after that, you, like many other retired biometricians, started your own LLC and started doing consulting on the side. So,
Well, yeah, the LLC was I had one consulting job back to Weyerhaeuser, and it was a stage one review of LiDAR, and I was not involved with LiDAR, but I was on the team to review it, and so that was the one job I ever did back for Weyerhaeuser, and I had to become my own LLC because I couldn't look like a Weyerhaeuser employee because I had already retired. And then I did one other job uh, that was putting a value on the burned timber on an 88,000 acre wildfire in a neighboring state. And like I said to people, I mean, we talked about this before. The valuation, the firm that I work for had hired two guys, a former Boise Cascade guy and another consultant, and from an inventory standpoint, and they were superior guys. And in fact, if I'd known them back in the day, they probably would have retired from Weyerhaeuser, not Boise Cascade. But anyway, the valuation was not that difficult, right? But the other side, we had to be prepared to understand and testify in court as to what they did and why it was wrong. Forensic biometrics, I call it. And well, it was something you want to do once. It's something I didn't ever want to do again. And so I hung up my shingle, and I still keep the business open because there's some advantages to have it open. Uh, but I spent my real time has been in the nonprofit sector. Uh, I've served on numerous boards, everything from a medical foundation uh, to Boy Scouts at several levels. I was 6 years with Habitat for Humanity and the Rapid City affiliate. Um, well, there are others as well. I'm trying to think. I just lost my train of thought here. Um, oh, I know. It was we built our home, built a log home in the Black Hills National Forest. And because the Homestead Act predated the Organic Act, which created the Forest Service and the National Forest System, there's a lot of homesteads and mining claims scattered out through the Black Hills National Forest, which, by the way, was the first forest in the National Forest System, oldest one. And so we're about 20 homes on a 160 acre former homestead, and we had our own or have our own water system. It was put in the pipes were put in the ground in 1977, and basically until 2008 or 2010, everybody paid $25 a month, and somebody took a quart of chlorine and poured it in the tank every month, and that was it.
well,
Well, then I won't go into all of it. I took it over in
yeah.
2008, kind of because the people that were doing it left town and moved to Australia and left the records on my front porch like a legitimate baby.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'll do my civic duty here. Well, after I learned the whole rural water system shtick, I realized that when we added one more house, we were a community water system, subject to all of the regulations of the Safe Drinking Water Act, all of the testing that a big city would do.
Mm.
And so I literally organized and did all the legal, led the legal work and everything to establish this water company.
Yeah.
And I was with it. It took me 15 years to divorce myself from it, but
Yeah.
a year ago in in the late 22, I turned it over to the board. And the good news is I have only got a couple calls since.
Yeah.
That was quite an undertaking and very interesting. I know more about rural water systems and rural water law than I ever thought I would.
Right.
And of course, in 2011, we got our first granddaughter.
Mhm.
In 2014, we got our second, and I can't get enough of them.
Yeah.
Now they're growing up, and I'm not quite the attraction I used to be, but I'm picking them up at 4:30 today. We're going to gymnastics, so.
Well, that's exciting.
But I've spent a lot of time with them down here in Auburn, and 'cause we have a number of friends, still from. Well, the guy that was my work study student, Glenn Glover, retired before I did. Glenn
Yeah.
lives down the road from us, and of course I'm good friends with Emmett Thompson, the former dean, Dick Brinker, a lot of friends here in Auburn as well. I have one last quick story. While I was working, I had an office at the forestry school. I was working on that wildfire,
Mhm.
and I got a call from the canoe base director. Well, I've been on the board of the National High Adventure Base, Northern Tier National High Adventure, for 38 years. It's the
Wow.
one scouting job I won't give up. But the director called me and he said, we've got a staff member here who's a forestry student at Auburn. You need to get to know him.
Yeah.
And I said, well, let's do that. And I did. And it was a guy named John Young. And John got real interested in what I was doing. He'd stop by my office, 2, 3 times a week. And he was interested in what I was doing. And when he got ready to graduate, he said, I think I want to go into biometrics.
Mhm.
I said, well, John, I'm not going to tell you where to go or what to do, but I wrote down 5 universities. I
Mhm.
said, if you go to any one of these universities and get a master's degree, you'll set yourself up to go to any of the other universities that you want to go to.
Yeah.
And so he ended up going to Minnesota
Mhm.
and got his master's degree, and then came back to Georgia. And he graduated a year ago.
Mhm.
And his email extension is warehouser.com, which I'm pretty proud of.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, he also was the recipient. There's an endowed scholarship in my name up at the Northern Tier. And
Mm.
the recipient of that while he was at Auburn.
Yeah.
We were all connected, and we get together now. He married his Auburn sweetheart, got twins now. But every Christmas we have a rendezvous either at her place, she's from Phoenix City, or our place, and we stay close to the Young family. So
Well, that's exciting. John is
it
one
is.
of the Weyerhaeuser employees I count amongst my friends. He is a wonderful guy.
He
I
is.
always enjoy my conversations with him,
Yep.
and such a small world. And I guess especially for the Boy Scouts who end up being forestry students.
Yeah. Yep. Well, in fact, in my work group in Federal Way, there were 5 of us, and our sons all became Eagle Scouts.
Yeah.
There were
Wow.
more than 5 of us, but of our work group,
Yeah.
5 Eagle Scouts in John's generation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, where I'm from, there was no possibility to be in the Scouts. We didn't have a Scout group. It was not to say we didn't learn similar things that the Scouts were learning, but we just didn't have the opportunity.
Sure.
So otherwise, I probably would have been a Scout. I spent enough time in the woods of East Texas to.
Let me give you an opportunity. When your son is 6 years old, he can join Cub Scouts, and you can be his den leader.
Yeah.
They'll train you.
If he is willing, then we will definitely join.
There you go. All right.
Well, I wanted to ask you because after you retired, you now split your time between Auburn and South Dakota.
Yep.
So you're going back and forth. You do winters and summers in each. So
Yep.
how did you end up? Because you had a short time in Auburn. What, about a year and a half there? between the master's and the PhD. And so why Auburn? Why would you choose to
I
move?
was at Auburn about 2.5 years, and
Okay.
we loved every minute of it. And again, it was kind of a scary thought. I mean, I had seen Selma on TV as a kid, and
Mhm.
George Wallace blocking the doors to the University of Alabama.
Yeah.
And never in a million years did I think I'd move to Alabama and then vote for him.
Yeah.
But he was the lesser of two evils, let me tell you. Big Jim Folsom was something else.
Yeah.
But anyway, well, then about 19, the early 90s, I was invited. They have an endowed lecture series here at Auburn called the Weaver Lectures.
Mhm.
And they bring people in from the outside to talk on various subjects. And in whatever year it was, maybe 91 or 92, I was the Weaver lecturer. And so we arranged it so that Steph and John could come with me over the their spring break in Washington. Well, of course, we get down to Auburn in April, and it's just, the azaleas, everything.
Yeah.
It's just a Garden of Eden, right?
Right.
And our son is a golfer, and all I could think about was Callaway Gardens and playing golf. And so what it turned out to be, in my opinion, was that it was a test. And I really enjoyed the lectures and everything, but after the whole thing was over, Emmett Thompson and George Bingston, who was the associate dean, came to me and said, "We'd like you to serve on the Auburn University Research Council at the university level."
Mhm.
And so that I did that, and I did it for 15 years.
Oh, wow.
And then I headed for many years the subcommittee on fisheries, forestry, ag, and vet medicine. And so anyway, I had all of that, two company paid trips a year to Auburn. So I got pretty well integrated into Auburn. And then, of course, when John was a junior in high school, he stood up at the dinner table and announced to his mom and me that he was going to Auburn.
Okay.
And I told Steph, I said, he'll meet some sweet young thing from Birmingham,
Yeah.
marry her, and he'll be there the rest of his life. Well, our daughter-in-law is from Vestavia.
Yeah.
I wish I picked stocks that well.
Right.
But anyway, he managed to get 5.5 years, 6 football seasons, and 2 degrees out of his parents, and which we were only too happy to do. He came to Auburn and thrived.
Mhm.
It just that's the only word I could use for it. He thrived.
Yeah.
Even when I'd come down for research council meetings, I would take he and whoever he wanted to invite to dinner, and we'd go to a restaurant, and invariably somebody would say, "Oh, hi, John. How are you, John?" I said, "John, you've been here too long. We can't go anywhere. They don't know you."
Right.
And that's just the way he is. And so he met his business partner in the School of Business, getting a finance degree. He has 2 degrees, one in political science. When he announced that, I wanted to put my eye out with an ice pick.
Yeah.
But it turned out it was a very good experience for him. Again, it was the age of instant news, overnight news, the connectivity. He had a view of the world that I didn't pretend to have.
Mhm.
10 years older than he was.
Yeah.
And so then he met his business partner in the business school. They studied finance together, and they put together a business plan to bring the Seattle music scene to Auburn.
Mhm.
In other words, Auburn was kind of dead at night.
Yeah.
And so they ended up winning this contest. And they
Wow.
said, "Well, if this is so good, why don't we do it?" Well, the answer is you don't have any money.
Yeah. Right.
So we spoke with his business partner's parents, and we found a way to put a banker between us and our sons, and still keep our money intact.
Yeah.
And the short story is that and then another friend of mine, I was on a tax resolution board in Texas, and the head of that said, "Well, these guys, the SBA official for the state of Alabama is in the School of Business where they're students.
Mhm.
They need to file, for an SBA loan while they're in their early 20s. They're both under 25. Apply for an SBA loan, and they get it funded at the full 85%.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a guarantee basically. Well, 5 years to the day from when they opened up their first place, they paid off their loan, and we got our our guarantee back. They opened a second place 15 months later and had it paid off in 5 years.
Wow.
And then of course they've now subsequently closed the first place, built a brand new place from the ground up, Southeastern. The other they're sports bars, by the way. And Southeastern is the newest one. And the second business that they owned, when they opened after, well, they named it 1716, which is the score of the famous Punt Bama Punt football game.
Yeah.
It took place 7 years before John was born.
Wow.
But it's very popular, as you might imagine. And
Yeah.
so then they have another business, a gourmet taco business that they reincarnated
Mhm.
and opened up, and they're living the life. Those guys are.
Yeah.
So John is here for the rest of his life, and so are so is his wife, our granddaughters. Who knows where they'll end up? But I'm sure they'll both go to Auburn. They're third generation
Mm.
legacies. So
Yeah.
anyway, that keeps us occupied here, and then they love coming up to South Dakota. They all love to fish trout. And they're good at it.
Yeah.
Even the granddaughters, they can throw an open face casting rig like spinning rig like no tomorrow.
Awesome.
And so anyway, we come down here and spend the winter and do all kinds of things with our family and go to seminars, and it's just a good life. The university towns are great places to retire.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we could end up here full time. It's just I'm not ready to give up
Yeah.
the Black Hills yet. So.
Right. Well, Dave, you've obviously had a very interesting career and post-career so far. One of the things that I like to ask is what over your career, what has surprised you? And you are the first one to put together some slides for me. So I'm going to go ahead and add those slides and let you tell that story of what it is.
Okay, well, this was a big surprise, and we get the slides going, and I'll narrate it.
And Dave, before you get started, we have people that listen that are unable to see. So whenever you talk about it, if you could describe what we're looking at. The first slide being just words, but just, pictures and graphs.
Yeah, the first slide is basically the motivation for what we called our test bed program. Mm-hmm. And to set the stage for this, I think I mentioned it earlier in the interview today, but the level of stocking or the planting spacing in Western plantations was confounded with year of planting. When high yield forestry took off, they basically wanted to make plantations look like the best natural stands. And as a result, they planted quite a few trees per acre. And it wasn't long before they saw that was too many, so they'd drop it. And they'd see it was still too many, so they'd drop it again. And so what we had was, with any kind of board back or any temporary plot data, or even any permanent plot data, that the age of the stand was confounded with spacing because of this historical question. So we were at Pack Forest. They had a really nice convention center there. It's a University of Washington's summer camp, but really nice facilities. We had our research team there. And the situation was, this was in 1983, and the situation was that initial spacing in existing Douglas fir was confounded with age, or the calendar year of establishment. Mm-hmm. So the question that we posed, or was posed to us, is that if we could pick up that telephone, there was a telephone in this room, and call back to the year 1966, which was the base year of high yield forestry at Weyerhaeuser, what would we ask George Stabler and Jim King to do that would be most useful to us today? So we get to go back 14 years and tell the legacy guys, here's what we'd like you to do. And the answer was, at several locations, establish a series of 5-acre contiguous blocks, each planted to a single spacing ranging from 100 to 1,000 trees per acre. And so the challenge there was that if it had been such a good idea in 1966, why isn't it a good idea today The answer, it is a good idea, and let's get started. And
Yeah.
so that's the background. Next slide, please.
Well, so before we move on, before some of our Weyerhaeuser friends get a little bit antsy, I just want to say this has been cleared to discuss.
Oh, has it ever? Yeah, yeah, has it
Mhm.
ever?
Yeah. So don't call the lawyers. This is okay.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, if I will tell you that we published on it in the refereed literature,
Okay.
and then that's really rare.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's in the Canadian Journal of Forestry Research, volume 28, pages 74 to 78, and it was published in 1998. So it was published 15 years after we had this meeting.
Okay.
But there was a lot of interesting things ensued. So yeah, we're in this whole presentation was actually made at Mike Newton's retirement at Oregon State University.
Mhm.
They did a day of what they called Newtonian silviculture, and I was invited to give this particular talk. So
Yeah. Okay. Moving on.
all right, so what we're looking at now is just a idealized map. It's actually an actual map of a 30-acre block, and it's broken into 6 5-acre plots, if you will. All of the site prep on that 30-acre block was done in the same way. All of the spacings were planted with the same seedlings on the same day. We just at different spacings.
Mhm.
And so anyway, in this particular case, we refined our spacings to go from 120 to 240 to 360 to 550 to 750 to 1200. And again, the practical people would say nobody in their right mind would plant 120. Nobody in their right mind would plant 1200. But the fact is, in modeling, we're putting together growth intervals to stitch together a mosaic of implied real growth series. And we wanted to go well beyond on either end what people would consider practical, because we wanted models that extrapolated well. And so that's why that was the logic for this. Okay, next slide, please.
Well, I just wanted to add in what year was this planted?
I would say it was probably planted in the mid 80s.
Yeah. Okay.
We're going to see data that have 3 ages of planting, or 3 stand ages, 7, 8, and 9. And you'll see what we've normalized the data so that we can make a comparison to show what we want to show. So,
Okay. Moving on.
okay. So what we started to see almost nearly immediately, but if we drove past one of these installations, we could see the different blocks. I mean, we could see some trees that were quite a bit taller than the others, and we could see it from the road.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an extreme case, but on the left side of the photo, that's Rod Mead, one of our research foresters, long retired. But on the left, on Rod's right, is the 120. And on the right, Rod's left, on the right side of the photo, is the 1200. And so those 2 plots or the others, all 6 of those plots, were subject to the exact same site preparation, the exact same planting stock, all planted on the same day.
Yeah.
And again, the environment changes with the wide spacings, but we looked at these things and we could see them from the road. And of course, everybody said, oh my gosh, tight spacing, trees are taller, so let's go to the next slide.
Well, for the people listening, what we're seeing is an old photo with the research forester standing in the middle. To his left is the planting spacing of 1,200 trees per acre, and you can quite clearly see the trees. They're much taller than him. And then to his right is the 120 trees per acre planting, and you can barely see any trees. So obviously some effect of planting density on tree height.
Yep. And then the one thing that you don't see here, but we did, in order to be able to define where these areas were, we planted a row of hemlock around the perimeter of every one of them. So you knew when you got one to the other, because we didn't know what it was going to look like when we planted them. So.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's go to the next slide then.
Okay, next slide.
All right, so this slide takes into account. I'm trying to think. There was probably 12 or a dozen of these test bed areas, either 7 years old, 8 years old, or 9 years old from planting.
Mm-hmm.
And what you see here is on the y-axis is the proportion of the 1,200 trees per acre. In other words, if you took the height, the average height of the 1,200, and then you made a ratio of the average height of the 120, the 240, the 360, etc. And so what you can see is that there's a direct correlation between average height relative to the 1,200 tree plot that's monotonically decreasing as you go down in spacing.
Mm-hmm.
So the trees are shorter at this point, 7, 8, or 9. Okay, so everybody pretty well bought into that. Well, sure, but the diameter on the 1,200 are going to be a lot smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at the next slide. There is the relative diameter, okay, where you can see on the right-hand side of the 1,200 trees per acre, the 1.0 is for diameter and height.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's relative diameter. But if you look and see that the diameter follows the trend in height. In other words, not only were the 1,200 trees per acre taller, but they were bigger in diameter.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw this everywhere we had one of these results,
Yeah.
or these installations. And oh, by the way, we saw it on hemlock and red alder as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we say to ourselves, what are we going to do about this? Because we've encouraged to get better coverage for a couple of reasons. One, to get better geographic coverage. We encouraged the stand management co-op to put in these kind of studies,
Mm-hmm.
which they agreed to. Everybody thought they were a good idea, and they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've got the same. They call them the type threes. Stand management co-op wasn't like Dave Lenhart. They had very we have type 1s and type 2s and type 3s. So that's pretty descriptive.
Yeah.
But anyway, we knew that they were going to see this.
Mm-hmm.
We literally knew they were going to see this. And so we made the decision, if we might as well get credit for it.
Right.
And so we went public with it, and we published it and started talking about it right about 1990, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Or 90, or the early 90s. We finally got it published in 98. But and the SMC saw these basic things. It was really interesting. The other thing is, for having the SMC do it as well, is it wasn't just a Weyerhaeuser thing.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that they saw it on other people's land just made it stronger. And so otherwise, Greg Johnson, for instance, was still at Willamette. And of course, he immediately labeled this the Weyerhaeuser effect. I thought, when he finally showed up at Weyerhaeuser, I said, "You still happy with that?"
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But at any rate, and then Chad Oliver, who had just finished his silviculture textbook, when he saw this graph, he said, "My gosh, couldn't you have done this a year early? I could have put it in my book."
Right. So for the people listening, I want to describe this a little bit more in detail, Dave, for the people listening, because this is hard to see. So what Dave's describing is a spacing study where they've planted 120 to 1,200 trees per acre. And he's showing a graph here that has the height and the diameter made relative to the 1,200 trees per acre plot. Yep. And so what it shows is at 120 trees per acre, the relative height and diameter is about 30% less than the 1,200 trees per acre planting. And then this kind of stair steps up as you increase planting density. So for me, the surprise here is the fact that the 1,200 TPA planting had the tallest trees and the biggest diameter trees compared to everything else, and that as you decreased your planting density, the relative height and diameter went down, which is the opposite of what we would expect. Not necessarily in height, but in diameter at least, we would expect at least some point where the diameters would be smaller as you increase planting density. And you didn't see that, which was the surprise.
Well, we didn't see that yet.
Yeah, yet.
Okay, what I will say, and it's nowhere in the presentation, is there is a cross that does cross over.
Yeah.
And it's just that not a lot of people had looked at stands this young on the West Coast. And then, of course, you've got the whole package, the Newton package. But if you look in the end, there's a couple of shots of loblolly pine,
Yeah.
Where it shows us the same thing.
Well,
again, it happens a lot quicker on loblolly pine than it does in the Douglas fir. But
yeah, so we have the results of those spacing trials that the Virginia Tech modeling co-op did, which goes up to, I think it's 800 trees per acre in loblolly pine. And there is indeed a crossover where you increasing planting density results in smaller diameter trees. Yeah, for sure.
But this violated everybody's sensibilities. And,
right.
Well, interesting. The same guy, Dave Depta, who is the metafunction guy. He was our client, and we finally took him out to show him some of these things. And he stood on the road and he said, "I see it, and I still don't believe it."
Yeah. Can you tell me what what year since planting this results are from?
This would be normalized. It was either 7, 8, or 9.
Okay.
We combined those three ages and normalize them because it shows what we want to show.
Right.
And I think there were 11 or 13 installations in there. So it wasn't just one or two. It was several. Yeah. And then the other thing that you probably didn't notice or ask about, but we talked about 100 to 1,000, and we ended up with 120 to 1,200.
Mm-hmm.
And if you sum those things all up and divide by n, what you get is the number of trees per acre that the regions were currently planting.
Okay.
Right, because they were our partners here. They had to site prep the land. They had to give us the land. They had to plant. We got them to do all of this for us.
Yeah.
Right? And the big complaint was, well, there's just too many trees. It's going to cost us too much.
Yeah.
So we designed the spacing so that the average number of trees was the same as if they planted it all to one spacing.
Awesome. That's brilliant. Yeah, I love. As you know, I did my PhD work on growth density relationships. So I really love looking at the effects of density, and I've made it probably a decade or more worth of my life studying that. And so I had never actually seen that. So I didn't read that 1998 paper that you said you published. So I'm going to have to go back and check it out.
Yeah, Bill Scott's the lead author. Bill Scott was our silviculturist, and then Rick Leon is his research forester. I think my name's down near the end somewhere.
Yeah. Dave, we're almost 2 hours into this, and I'm not going to delete a single piece of this. I've enjoyed this conversation so much, and I want to let it stand for eternity. I want to tell you, I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you coming and telling your story so other people can hear it.
Well, this has been a lot of fun, and I've been really looking forward to it because I enjoyed Strube's and Greg Johnson's and Tom's and John Paul's. I mean, I'm going to see all of these. My only regret, is that we didn't have the technology to do this with Jerry Clutter, and John Moser and Otis Hall and FX Schumacher, and we just lost all of that. Yeah. There's only of the original four of Jerry's, the Burkhart and Lenhart are both gone. And Sullivan and Bailey are both in their 80s now.
Yeah.
But I can arrange it if you want to interview them.
Yeah, well, if you have contacts, I'd love to get them on the podcast. I, of course, don't know them personally, but it would be great. And, sometimes, whenever you hit 80 plus years old, you're not necessarily as interested in doing these kind of interviews.
That's true. That's true.
But with a little encouragement from some people that they love, it would probably help.
Well, I'll shoot him. We're all on Facebook together, so.
Yeah. Great.
And,
No, well, thank you again so much, Dave.
well, you're very welcome, and it's my pleasure.
Yeah. Well, hang on.
I'm glad you're doing this. Somebody needs to do it, and I'm
Yeah.
sure glad you've taken it up. So,
Well, again, I've said before, I'm not, I don't consider myself the best person to do this, but as somebody told me once, maybe the best person to do it is the one that's doing it. So
there you go.
I'm very happy. And again, it's a little bit selfish on my part because this is all to satisfy my need to know the people that came before me and to understand, why people do what they do. And, also to help me understand myself. Why am I the way that I am? And I can see myself through
Good
others.
luck with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll close with just 2 words, Mickey.
Okay.
Axum Jacks.
Axum Jacks. There you go. Hang on. I'm going to turn this thing off and we'll have a conversation. But again, thank you for coming on and thank you everybody for listening.
So long.